Hey everybody, welcome back to Reckoning with Jason Herbert. And this week we are returning to the vault in honor of July 4th weekend. We decided we would come back to an older episode that maybe some of you haven't heard, one of our earliest episodes featuring two of my great friends, Craig Bruce Smith and Robert Greene II. And the film we're talking about is, as you guessed, Mel Gibson's The Patriot from 2000. And the conversation we have today is about the role of nostalgia in creating public memory and national identity, and the ethics behind creating historical dramas. And of course, is The Patriot a guilty pleasure film? So this is a movie we love for a lot of different reasons that maybe we shouldn't, but that's all right. You can hear us squirm a little bit. So sit back and relax, because The Patriot is next on Reckoning with Jason Herbert.
All right, fuck it. I'm just going to say it. The Patriot is a huge pile of historical shit. And we're going to talk about it today anyway. You know, movies like The Patriot are really interesting because they can be a lot of fun to watch. And in a lot of ways, maybe that's kind of what spurred on historians of the movies at some point in time, where these ideas of these movies that play fast and loose with history, and yet we are compelled to watch them. This movie is a lot of fun to watch in a lot of ways. Now, it's not like Gone with the Wind, another movie that really plays fast and loose with history, even though more dangerously than The Patriot ever will be, because really people really take Gone with the Wind to be gospel when it comes to be American history. At least there's a certain portion of folks who do. And I don't know that really anyone's looking back at this 2000 film starring Mel Gibson and Jason Isaacs and Heath Ledger as somehow historically accurate. But if you're not watching with a close eye, there's a lot of stuff that can slide by. And that's part of the reason why we want to watch these movies. You know, when people started talking about HATM, originally the idea, people I think thought we would take these movies and almost do like an MST3K idea where we sat back and watched the movie and made fun of it the whole time. And frankly, that just doesn't interest me at all. I think that's kind of boring to sit back and make fun of somebody's work after they've spent all this time, especially when you think about the many, many, many people who go through to make these films. And it's part of the reason why I like showing these things, is so we can say, okay, wait a second, is there a grain of truth we can take here? Is there something we can take away from? Yeah, absolutely. In a case like The Patriot, we're going to have fun with it, and you're going to hear that in the podcast today. It's silly. It takes itself very seriously. I was just looking just now. This movie is 2 hours and 45 minutes long. I have no doubt that Mel Gibson and director Roland Emmerich thought that they were making the next American epic, especially coming off of Braveheart. You know, Mel Gibson's other not so quite incredibly accurate historical film piece, right? In fact, I think maybe if we're looking back at his own filmography, maybe we think that Mad Max might be his most accurate piece. I don't know. Maybe Lethal Weapon 3, where they're talking about gangs and bullets and things like that. I don't know. But this movie's a lot of fun. And it's fun in a lot of different ways. You're going to hear our two guests today kind of debate that back and forth, talking about why we can take a movie that's really cringe at some points and still enjoy watching it. What does this have to say? And this is the big thing that I really like to talk about when I talk about these movies is this movie comes out in 2000, right? So what does a movie like The Patriot have to say to the audience? What does it have to say about the people who are buying tickets to go see the film in theaters, and what their expectations are and what their perceptions are coming out of this film about American history? So a lot of folks had really wanted to watch this early on with HATM. We tried to get it lined up, and we just couldn't. It just wasn't available until we finally were able to get it showing. And it was one of our big nights because people were really keyed in, ready to go off on this movie. So I hope you're going to enjoy two people tonight that we have. The podcast tonight, I actually taped during the middle of a hurricane. Those of you who know, I live down in Florida, so we are prone to natural disasters from time to time. And I think you're really going to, you'll hear that in a little bit in our talk today. So there'll be a few spots where I black out, but don't worry. We got Craig Bruce Smith and Robert Greene II who are going to come along and hold down the fort during this talk today. And in fact, these two guys, if you haven't seen me talking on Twitter about this, my conversations with these two gentlemen actually predate all of historians of the movies. Conversations we had. In fact, my basis of friendship with these two guys actually goes back to a conversation we had on the greatest, most powerful form of Arnold Schwarzenegger. We will get into that conversation on the very first HATM podcast we ever recorded. I'm holding that one back. We go into a full in-depth discussion on Predator
and all things Schwarzenegger. But today we're going to talk about another import. Is Mel Gibson an import? He was born in the States, grew up in Australia. I don't know who claims him. I think we talk about this on the Crocodile Dundee podcast that's coming up soon. But these two guys are awesome. You're going to love this talk. And without further ado, here's the Patriot, the Historians of the Movies podcast. And hey, how are you? Welcome. Greetings, buenos tardes, bonsoir, bonjour. It's nighttime. Welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm your host, Jason Herbert. And across from me are two of the most patriotic historians you'll ever get to meet. Craig Bruce Smith is an associate professor of history at the National Defense University in the Joint Advanced Warfighting School in Norfolk, Virginia, and he's authored American Honor, the Creation of the Nation's Ideals During the Revolutionary Era, and co-authored George Washington's Lessons in Ethical Leadership. Robert Greene II is an assistant professor of history at Claflin University and publications chair for the Society of United States Intellectual Historians and lead associate editor for Black Perspectives. Craig, do you want to do your disclaimer?
Yeah, I have to say that all views are my own and do not represent those of anyone, including Tom Cruise.
All right. Rob, do you have any disclaimers for yourself?
Not really. I'm just ready to go.
All right, cool. My views actually represent everyone. I am omnipotent. Guys, welcome back. This is our second podcast. You guys, as you guys know,
you added structure and things now. It's like,
well, don't worry about it. We're not going to let structure get in the way, because why let facts get in the way of a good story, which is kind of maybe the whole point of talking about the Patriot tonight. Okay, so if you're listening right now, what you don't know is that I sent out this little email to Craig and Rob's like, hey, here's some things we're going to talk about when we talk about the movie. Not that we're not just going to completely go throughout the entirety of the Patriot here. So, but I was trying to give us some basic pointers and so forth, such as, gentlemen, why do we like talking about the Patriot?
We like talking about the Patriot because in a lot of ways, it's an easy movie to tear apart for a lot of reasons. Right? There's things you could say, this is ridiculous. It's a revenge movie. The plot's over the top. The violence is over the top. There are obvious historical mistakes, anachronisms. It's got Mel Gibson, who you pretty much have carte blanche to say pretty much anything you want about Mel Gibson these days. So it's a really easy target. However, there aren't movies about the American Revolution. So because of that, this one takes prominence, probably gets more prominence than it should have. But what's the other big epic American Revolution movie? Well, Al Pacino did one in the 80s. Have you ever seen it? No one has.
Nope.
So that's my point. There are very few American Revolution movies. So this one is what really comes to the forefront. It's not a musical, People love musicals, but there's only so historically accurate a musical can be. Even though I think 1776 is probably the best American Revolution movie.
Are you plugging your recent article?
Oh, I'm not plugging my recent article. I was going to plug my old one, but yeah, you can read about my latest review of 1776 in Time magazine, where as Derek Zoolander says, not many people have read your Time magazine.
I did read that. I actually read that. I texted you that I read it. I was very proud of myself for reading your Time magazine article. Rob, what do you think? How do you feel about this movie?
Well, I think Craig's absolutely right. Like the fact that there aren't very many or any really epic Revolutionary War films means that the Patriot is by default going to be one folks look back to. I also think it fits into the Mel Gibson I Hate the British series of films that he has starred in over the years. So it's kind of a coda to that. But I also think that the Patriot, as many problems as it has, it's also perhaps the most American of history films made in the last 25 years, in the sense that it is this over-the-top action movie about America's founding. And the fact that we haven't had more of those is actually a bit surprising, now that I think about it. But I think the Patriot and what it embodies and the fact that it says so much about the Revolutionary Era, at the very least, it shows folks still care about America's founding, even though the story here is a bit on the fictional side.
Oh yeah, Rob, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I never really thought about it, but you could be right. Is it perhaps the most American movie until Top Gun Maverick? It might be.
It does feel rather patriotic. This movie is. We had a couple things come out recently that kind of start to address. This movie is 23 years old, 22, 23 years old now. It came out in 2000, right? So we talk about, people shows people were still interested in the revolution. I'm like, does it? Because that was literally an entire generation ago. And you would think actually, maybe it's I don't know, maybe is it the cost of the event of filming these period films that's prohibiting us from getting more of these kinds of stories or something like that? Because you would think.
So I've heard varying reasons for this. So I did an article. Here's another plug for Spectator USA on the 20th anniversary of the Patriot. So I basically did a relook at it, and doing research for this, the big question is, well, why aren't there more American Revolutionary movies? There's, the John Adams miniseries, which I think is excellent. You could argue with,
love that series.
It's phenomenal. You've got obviously the Hamilton musical. You got 1776. You've got some like revolutionary adjacent movies. There's a movie called Sweet Liberty starring Alan Alda and Michael Caine. And Michael Caine plays Bannister Tarleton, and it's about the Southern campaign. So roughly the same sort of.
When did this movie come out? Like 1972?
It came out in the 80s, and the premise is Alan Alda is this very academic historian who doesn't like that his book, his academically true story, has been turned into a fictionalized account. And Michael Caine insists on playing Bannister Tarleton as a gentleman, and then the historian Alan Alda, I think, runs off with Michelle Pfeiffer briefly, which we all know is completely nonsense. And
I very much want to watch this movie now.
Yeah, it's worth seeing, but don't expect much. So the thing is, there aren't that many American Revolutionary movies. So why not? Okay, I've heard a couple of variants of this. One of them that I've heard is that they don't do well internationally, which is why they don't get made. So it's hard to sell, rah Mel Gibson impaling a horse with an American flag to the Russians, for instance. I don't know. I'm picking a country.
Russia's not the big market. It's China, right? That everybody's trying to.
We know that China has had issues with movies that are too American. So I don't know how these films would be accepted internationally. I imagine Hamilton is actually probably done well. I don't know internationally. So I think that's part of it. I don't think we've got big budget movies all the time. Think about Les Mis. What did that cost? I mean, everyone in that movie is a star. Everything is, the costumes are excellent. The sets are excellent. So I don't think it's cost. I think it's probably the perception of how it will do. Mm-hmm. At a global box office. So I think now we're more focused on a global box office than we ever were, certainly than we were when the Patriot came out. That's my guess, but I have no hard evidence for it.
That's a really interesting point, because as we were preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about Revolutionary War films, and I found myself having a difficult time thinking of any beyond the Patriot and a handful of others. In fact, I think Craig makes a good point about Revolutionary War adjacent films being perhaps more popular, because I thought of Barry Lyndon, for instance, Last of the Mohicans, which are films set before the Revolutionary War, or even of shows like Roots.
Oh, yeah.
That touch on the Revolutionary War, but aren't about it.
And what we could say is perhaps, I would argue, the most successful American Revolutionary War movie of all time is National Treasure.
Go on.
Think about it. The movie is fundamentally about a mystery revolving around the American Revolution and the founders. After that, they visit a variety of historic sites, Independence Hall, Trinity Church. They mention a bunch of others, name drop, Ben Franklin and, Paul Revere, random stuff like that. So fundamentally, it's about the American Revolution, but the movie itself really is an American Revolution period piece. But that movie, find me a person that doesn't like National Treasure.
Do you find it interesting that when I think about, I think when most people approach the American Revolution, they usually get caught up in that Northern campaign. And, the interesting thing about the Patriot is it's very much rooted in the Southern campaign. It's rooted in South Carolina.
Right.
You find that interesting that, of all the places for this unlikely one Revolutionary War action movie, which is what it is, right? It's very straightforward, and it's a very by the numbers beat, right? I think there's some really cool stuff that it does well, specifically, it's like allusions to like the 7 Years' War, and it's really showing the distrust of the French on the part of a lot of the colonists and so forth. But like I found it really interesting that like of all these movies, we're gonna have one set in South Carolina, culminating at the Battle of Cowpens and things that most people aren't familiar. Most people, when they come to know the Revolutionary War in, say, high school or maybe even college, they're thinking about Yorktown, Saratoga, or something like that, and they don't really think about the South. But South has this huge role in the war.
It absolutely does. I mean, the Southern campaigns are critical, and it's the Southern campaigns that allow for the Yorktown victory at the Siege of Yorktown, right? So Nathaniel Greene is able to basically get Cornwallis to move into Virginia, and this is it's all connected. Why isn't there a Northern theater movie? I'll hazard a guess that you go to the Northern campaigns, you're dealing with the heavy hitters. You've got like Washington, and so you're basically playing Washington. And if you want to make it more of a fictional film, creating someone, I think maybe a lesser known campaign might make that easier to do. I mean, Washington has that one like brief, you see him, on a horse for 2 seconds. I mean, that could have something to do with it. It's also, I think they're very much, this film is based on an older, the story of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, which was a Disney film starring Leslie Nielsen, and I think the 50s, I want to say. I mean, it is a small miniseries, but we had in the 1950s. So it's not necessarily new. It's been done before, but I think the South is lesser known. And I think that's what allows it to perhaps have more of the fictional element. Whereas something like Washington's Crossing, people have seen the image. They have a basic understanding of it. I don't know. Speculation.
I do think it's interesting too, because I grew up in Georgia and I currently work in South Carolina. And even in the Deep South, I think most people don't really think about the Revolutionary War as having its decisive moments in the South.
No.
I know that talking to students at Claflin, which is in South Carolina, when I say to them, oh, do you know how many battles were actually fought here in the Revolutionary War? They're pretty stunned to find out how important the state actually, or the colony was, to the actual theater of operations in the South. I would venture a guess. I think part of it is how we teach the Revolution in K through 12, which is Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and then you fast forward to Yorktown. And I think even thinking about how the U.S. sees the South as a region, I think also kind of hurts as well, because if you think of the South as being the decisive endpoint Revolutionary War, it really brings the South in a way that I think most U.S. history accounts don't. They think of the South as this other place, especially up until the Civil War. So I think, again, the Patriot represents a lot of interesting strands of intellectual thought about American history and American culture that, of course, is overwhelmed by the fact that it's Mel Gibson killing British people.
Rob, I think it's a great point. And the Civil War does loom very large in the South, and perhaps even overshadowing the American Revolution. I mean, there have been films on Northern campaigns, but they've been like made for TV movies. Like there's The Crossing with Jeff Daniels and was it Aidan Quinn, I think, played Benedict Arnold. I think that's right. But these are like A&E, TV movies. They're not going to have the same reach as a big budget, blockbuster.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing, like, we see some of the Northern campaigns in John Adams, right? And the way that, the way that those battles or the way those campaigns were fought, Washington's largely doing these strategic retreats, just trying to buy time and so forth. And, you see, it doesn't make for good film, actually, right? So, like, when you're watching John Adams, which is, again, something that I think the three of us really dig, when you see those men that Washington is trying to lead, they're hunkered around a fire. It's cold. It's stationary. They're freezing. Aesthetically, it's just not pleasing. It just doesn't look good on a camera. You don't want to spend your eyes don't want to spend a lot of time on that screen.
So what I will say, the show Turn about Washington's spies and espionage, they did it very well. But to your point, it was juxtaposed with like action espionage scenes. So they'd show Valley Forge and they'd show, camp followers, and they'd show life in, of the average person, but then it would be, ooh, look at my secret writing, and I'm knifing some redcoat somewhere.
I think even with the idea of Valley Forge, I was actually going to come with a hot take of my own about that.
Go for
which
it.
is, I think if you're thinking about great films about Valley Forge, the best one might be The Empire Strikes Back. Because it begins on Hoth. And I've heard this joke for years. You think about it, right? The rebels have been forced to retreat to Hoth. They're living in a winter condition. They're trying to escape from the Empire. And in a way, Hoth is basically Space Valley Forge in a lot of ways. It's a bit of a ridiculous point, but again, it gets back to the idea that so much of American cinema, in terms of thinking about the revolution, does it indirectly. It takes symbols and motifs of the Revolutionary era, but doesn't really make Revolutionary War films.
Mm-hmm. Coming soon from Rob Greene at the next Society of Intellectual Historians conference.
Well, I wonder if, it feels like there's so many moving parts that maybe telling the story of the revolution, if you're doing it from like a historical perspective, works better as like a Netflix kind of series than it does. Mm-hmm. It's so hard to because ultimately this isn't, I kind of get the feeling this isn't necessarily this movie is about the revolution, but really what it is, it's really a revenge story that uses the revolution as a backdrop to tell a story, right?
I think that's absolutely right.
It's not trying to tell the story of the American Revolution. It takes too many liberties with that, right? Ultimately, it's like you use this as a backdrop. Oh, we need a guy who saw some war. Okay, cool. And he did some really bad things in the war. Okay, oh, in the previous war. Okay, gotcha. Oh, this fits very well, right? We need to sell it to this American hysteria of like rah rah Americana. We also know Mel Gibson does this really well with Braveheart, and because it's very much Braveheart in the United States. I mean, Randall Wallace obviously involved. It just feels very much following along those very same beats that.
And they're releasing it on 4th of July weekend. What could go wrong with this?
All right. Well, you talk about what could go wrong. Let's go ahead and let's be those historians. So for people who are listening right now, who's like, but I love the Patriot. What's wrong with the Patriot? The Patriot's wonderful. It's like America.
Hey, I like the Patriot. I will go on record saying I like the Patriot.
You have gone on record. We did this on KTM, right? And you have been a staunch defender, and I think rightfully so, right? The movie has its flaws, at least for me, right? The movie's got its own flaws, right? I mean, all movies do, but I think, Craig, the thing you had always talked about is like the larger story is trying to tell makes it an enjoyable story about, American Civil War. But let's dig in this for a second, because let's just go ahead and acknowledge some of the problems that like the film has, like as historians, or like what people might say, hey.
So the biggest thing, and it's Spike Lee called it out when the movie came out. It's true then, it's true today. Slavery is basically absent. Now, there are slaves in the movie. There are depictions of the enslaved. It's very, very brief. The most ridiculous part is Mel Gibson's plantation of freemen. In South Carolina in the 1770s, this would have been completely unthinkable. They're trying to hearken to the later, John Lawrence offering, freedom to the enslaved who would fight, which was put down by South Carolina. This wasn't accepted. But that is just egregious. There's no way around it. And I know the director and the producer said, well, we didn't want to make him, Mel Gibson's character, Benjamin Martin, we didn't want to make him a slaveholder because then we couldn't make him a hero. And they couldn't find a way out of it. So they opted for, well, we're going to go for not really showing slavery, which is just fundamentally inaccurate.
Right.
Yeah, I think that actually kind of, again, shows two things. Number one, I wonder sometimes how The Patriot would work as, say, a Netflix miniseries, where you might be able to further delve in some of these issues. But then that's not the point. I mean, like we've already established, The Patriot was a revenge film. It's set in the Revolutionary era. So it's not going to do as great a job with some of these more nuanced issues. But I will say, watching the film, even as a teenager, watching it and being aware of the history of slavery during the Revolutionary era, when I watched it, I thought to myself, okay, they have to deal with this at some point. And then, as Craig mentioned, the enslaved briefly show up, and then they kind of disappear, and you're thinking, well, wait, this seems kind of off. And also the film does kind of get into these ideas about the black presence in both the Patriot and Redcoat armies, because you do see brief scenes of the British. You see black soldiers with them, and of course with the Patriots, you do see the story of black men fighting alongside Patriots in South Carolina, and getting into this idea of, and I think this is what makes the movie so interesting. This genuine ragtag militia fighting against the British Army. But I think Craig's absolutely right. How it deals with slavery is one of the things that the movie, I think, will always be called out for, no matter what.
Yeah, probably rightfully so. But I think it also the fact that it dances around that or absolutely just avoids it altogether, right? Kind of also largely speaks, when you're talking about, it's like, well, we can't have Benjamin Martin as a slaveholder because he could be a hero. Then what does it say when we think about people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson? We think about the nation's own foundations and so forth, right? These folks, I mean, it does point to these ideas, these really complicated issues of, okay, I want to like George Washington, who's founder of the country and first president and blah, blah, blah. But he also held people in bondage, right? He held people, and like we know that Washington was a pretty strict dude, right? I cannot imagine that the people he held, dominion over had a good life. I'm not a Washington scholar. It's kind of, it's beyond me, but Craig, you are. Maybe you can speak to that.
So the best book on that, I refer to a book by Mary Thompson called The Only Subject of Regret, which I think is the best book on Washington and slavery. And it's a complicated issue. And Washington himself is going to change over time in how he views slavery. And he's going to view over time how he views the service of African Americans, both free and enslaved in the Continental Army. By his death, he has recognized the wrongs of slavery, and in his will, yes, there's asterisks on this, but he's going to free his slaves. There's an asterisk of upon the death of his wife. Martha ultimately frees them earlier because she's afraid for her safety, because it says upon her death, freedom upon her death. It doesn't specify how she has to die, so she does free them early. But it is a complicated issue, and I think if you would have made Martin a slaveholder, I think it would have really played into this, an actual tangible thing. And a movie podcast isn't I don't think the place to get into all these nuances. Why it should, how do we grapple with this? But we know the society right now is grappling with this.
Is the movie a better movie with Martin as a slaveholder?
That's a good question.
It's a more accurate movie.
I think it's a different kind of movie as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it stops being so much of a, I don't know, maybe it's not as much of a revenge film because you start to interject more maybe historical truths into it or something like that. But it's like, it really complicates a guy like Martin. And I also feel like when you acknowledge this stuff, it brings a certain level of humanity to them. And by that, I mean, humans are capable of immense good, but also immense evil, right? We've seen that through any number of things, right? And we see people who have the capability of both, frankly, right? Here's obviously a guy who loves his family, who mourns his late wife, does not want to be part of war. And then if you acknowledge him as a slaveholder, what does this say about his peaceful nature when slavery is inherently a violent institution?
Well, I think you're exactly right. It says that, like anything else in history, we have to look at men and women in the past with at least some nuance, depending on what they did. Again, going back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, it's difficult, if not impossible, to tell the story of the nation's founding without talking about those two men. And even if you talk about the fact that they were both slaveholders, that they, especially Jefferson, did terrible things to their slaves.
Absolutely.
That what that really says to me is you have to understand just how difficult really reading and understanding history can be. And I think a film like The Patriot reminds us that when we see films made about historical events, what you're really doing is you're dipping your toes into the water of a much vaster narrative. Certainly The Patriot, no one I think would say is the definitive account of the revolution on film. It's an entertaining film.
It's not trying to be, right?
Yeah, but it's not trying to be. I think
right.
We have to recognize that nuance,
And that's the thing. Gibson actually, at the time, calls this movie pure fiction. Outright says it. So there's no illusion here. The illusion is basically by the view. This is placed on it by the viewers who were perhaps coming to want to come away from this with Oh, you mean I could learn the history of the American Revolution in 2 hours and 20 minutes or whatever the runtime is? I mean, I don't know. Because they never claim it is.
Yeah, but isn't that the danger in a film like this, though, right? Where it can be perceived as such as that, like, a guy Gibson can say, "Hey, this is this is pure fiction. We're playing with some ideas here, but ultimately trying to tell a heroism story, right, of a particular man, right?" And I kind of wonder, for me, I'm starting to think now about a film maybe like Gone with the Wind, right, which had so much to do with the way that people envision antebellum South. Whether or not it was claiming to be at the time historically accurate or not, people through pop culture come to accept the things that they see on film as at least in containing a portion of truth. And I think that when we talk about the absence of enslaved peoples, right, it starts to tell the story of nobility of the planter elite in the South that probably isn't there.
Oh, and that's not untrue. But again, what I will say for the Patriot is it's not simply the elites. This is in the film. It's backcountry. It's lower classes. You see a fairly for the free white class, a pretty diverse picture of the free white classes of South Carolina, which is different from Gone with the Wind. But I think you're completely right that films have a reach that, and I say this all the time and I get in trouble, films have a reach that all the historians combined do not have sometimes.
You are not going to make a certain president of the American Historical Association happy with that, but we don't care about that. I wanted to ask you guys there's another big hit on this. I heard both of you kind of speak to previously when we talked about this film. And now, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen listening to this podcast, we're going to have to introduce a new topic here in Historians of Movies called We Defend the British. So we talk about some of the errors in this film, and some of them have to do with the depictions of the British during the war. Can you guys speak to that at all?
Yeah. So there are a couple of issues, but the big one that, the elephant in the room is the church burning scene. So let's just start with it. Let's lay it all out.
Maybe we should have started the podcast with burning it. No, we should go.
All right. So the church burning scene where Jason Isaacs, who plays Colonel William Tavington, who is loosely based on Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Why did they go with William Tavington over Bannister Tarleton? I guess it's easier to say. I don't know. Or make it more.
I think fictional. It allows a plausibility of because that's the reason why you have Benjamin Martin, right?
Yeah.
Instead of Francis Marion.
That's probably right. So in the film, a town that has aided Martin, including his daughter-in-law, are locked in a church and they're burned alive. And the torch is actually thrown not by Tavington, but by a loyalist played, I think it's Captain Wilkins, who's played by Adam Baldwin, who you may remember from such films as Full Metal Jacket. So the church is burned. They all die.
And Firefly. Or is it Serenity?
Serenity.
Tavington says something, honors found in the ends, not the means. This will be forgotten, but with a British accent. And this is the thing that sent everyone into a rage, particularly British film critics. So I'm going to read one line. This is from the New York Post film critic, Jonathan Foreman, who was British born, that it made the Redcoats cartoonish paragons of evil who commit one monstrous but wholly invented atrocity after another. And he says it was basically equating them to the 18th century equivalent of the Nazi SS. Okay. And there are examples of Nazis literally burning people alive in churches. So completely fair. Now, here's where I push back on that. And Rob, do you want to jump in, or should I give my pushback on why?
No, I would go ahead with the pushback. I'm interested to hear.
Rob's gearing up to say that Britain is like Cloud City.
No.
So here's the pushback. Absolutely, there's this art. They make the British particularly villainous. They're like mustache twiddling, central casting. Like, who are we going to get? Oh, let's get Jason Isaacs. This helps get. I'm willing to bet this helps get Jason Isaacs. The Harry Potter franchise. Because he's just so villainous.
He's a terrific villain. He's a scene-stealing guy.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a huge fan.
Here's my pushback. And I have to give credit to historian Benjamin Karp on this because he pointed me to this. I hadn't known this. Now, there's all sorts of loyalist versus patriot, partisan fighting. And there are absolutely Tories, so loyalists that are supporting the British. There are patriots that are fighting against them. And there are two accounts that are very, very similar to this church burning scene. Not exactly, but enough that you could start to question, well, is this really inaccurate? One of them is in South Carolina. There's a British major named James Wemyss, and he attempts to burn a woman and child alive in her home. And then I believe she escapes. Also in South Carolina, there is another British captain named Christian Huck. And this is passed down in town lore, so it's only really recorded in the 1870s. So there's some distance here, and I'm going to quote this. He threatened to burn the church and people to frighten disturbers of the king's peace. So doesn't happen, but there is actual evidence that the British attempted to burn people alive and threatened to literally burn people alive in a church because they had aided the Patriots. So is it really that inaccurate? I don't know. Here's the thing. Did the directors know about this? I would say no, because it's in some obscure South Carolina, parish records. And if they knew about it, that was the first thing they probably would have said in a press conference when they were pushed on it. So maybe not as inaccurate. Maybe it's not inaccurate, but the directors didn't know that.
Right.
I would certainly add to that, too. I think what that scene really gets at, and I think this is one of the strengths of the Patriot, is that it leads us to not thinking of the Revolutionary War simply as these two armies battling out in massive fields, but it's really getting into the grit and grime of this is actually also a civil war on the ground. It is a partisan war. It is a war like all other wars. It's a lot uglier than we want to admit it was. And so while we can certainly argue over the accuracy of that particular scene, I think the spirit of it, and this is, I think, the point of The Patriot itself as a film, the spirit of the film in some ways captures elements of the Revolutionary War that are actually worth remembering and thinking about.
And I think it does so in that, in a lot of ways, it is sanitized in some depictions. And to this point, I mean, there's that line that Tavington says after he shoots one of Benjamin Martin's kids, who tries to the second oldest, who tries to save Heath Ledger when he's being carried away as a spy, and he says, "Would you like a lesson, sir, in the rules of war? Or perhaps your children would." And it's really playing with that, the idea of gentility, honor, the rules of war, and how these are frequently broken based on a variety of interpretations, both, for individual gain, for different interpretations, for treatment of people deemed rebels or those on opposing sides of conflict. So I think Rob's right. It does play with these deeper issues, but in its depiction, sometimes it gets glossed over by this clear, like, sort of black and white, hero and villain.
Both of you are kind of talking about this as well, as like this idea that this is very much a civil war as well, right? And I think a lot of ways, the way this war is often presented, K through 12, maybe even in undergraduate courses, like in a survey course, often taught these ideas of liberty and freedom and things like that. But certainly in the South, I also come to feel that this is a very personal war. Right. On the part, like, right. You quite literally know who you're fighting against, and that's really kind of the idea of, like, a civil war is like, and you do get a sense of this in this film as well. Right. I'm thinking specifically about, the one guy who actually kills himself after coming back and finding his family had died and so forth. But it's like, you get a sense, like, the other guys, and it's the very personal grudge against you don't get a sense in The Patriot here that, these guys are fighting for this large ideal. Mel Gibson himself wants nothing to do with this war, with this coming war, early in the film, and only gets compelled into it after, the murder of his of his son, right?
So I'll push back on that. And I think you're right that Martin says, can the something along the lines, can the colonies govern themselves? Yes, I believe they can, and they believe they should. But will I stand against England? No. But Gabriel Martin, who's played by Heath Ledger, fits in for the ideological. And he's the one who's talking about liberty. He's the one that's, sewing the tattered American flag. He's the one that's talking about building a new world and the promise of freedom when he's talking to an enslaved soldier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he represents that. So I think you have figures that represent different elements of the wider conflict. You've got Checky Caro playing, the Frenchman. You've got, the backwoodsman. You've got the Reverend. You've got the pompous aristocratic Cornwallis. You've got the villainous Cavington. You've got the kind-hearted, thank you for giving quarter to His Majesty's troops guy who's the first one to take a bullet in the head. So I think there are different representations here. And I think the ideological is there, but the main focus is always revenge. This is fundamentally a war between two men. That's what it boils down to.
Can either of you guys speak to like how the American Revolution is remembered in Great Britain, like to this day? Obviously, it's celebrated here in the United States, but how was this presented overseas?
Well, again, what is actually taught in curriculum? Again, there are going to be many British students that are just not going to learn about it. Britain has a lot of history. It's easy to leave out the time you don't win.
Those are my ancestors, so I guess. Yeah, go on.
So it's I can't speak to the curriculum, but I can say it's less taught. And when I encounter people from the UK, they always ask me questions about the American Revolution because they generally want to know about it, and they understand the basic concept, but it's also sometimes a misunderstanding of what the war is literally about. I mean, a lot of it is, well, you rebelled about taxes. And I say, well, that's just one part of a larger issue. The taxes are just, a symbol of a deeper ideological movement. And I think it doesn't necessarily translate in the same way. And I think that may be part of the reason that there aren't more revolutionary movies. They just may not translate. It's lesser studied in Britain. However, you do have some phenomenal British-born American revolutionary historians. So clearly, it is being taught, and you have right now you have some phenomenal British-born American historians teaching at the college level in Britain. The one thing I will say, throughout all of it, George Washington is celebrated, even many times during the revolution itself. And you can find a statue of George Washington in Trafalgar Square that was dedicated and remarked that it went up because he was the most English of Englishmen.
What about our representation? You guys touched on this idea a little bit earlier, but like, how do we feel about Tom Wilkinson in this movie as Lord Cornwallis?
Oh, he steals the whole movie.
I just can't so I'm drawing back and forth. I mean, this is the same guy who gets to play Benjamin Franklin in John Adams. Yep. Right. So I just love the duality of Wilkinson, who gets to play these two huge figures in the American Revolution on opposing sides.
He's that good.
I mean, I think it's funny because, I will watch Wilkinson as Cornwallis and watch Wilkinson as Benjamin Franklin and forget it's the same guy playing both roles because he's so good in both of them. I
remember I saw the Patriot opening day in 2000. I remember seeing it. I mean, seeing all the coming attractions. Oh, I got to see this. And I remember going and, watch the whole movie. The line that stuck with me, and maybe this speaks to my own strangeness, but the line I and my friends repeated more than any other, not, before this war is over, I'm going to kill you. Not that. It was Tom Wilkinson as Cornwallis. That man insults me. It's brilliant. He's there with his embroidered dinner jacket, throwing down his handkerchief with his, lace cuffs peeking out. Cornwallis was an able soldier. He had distinguished himself, but he plays them in a way that this is what the American audiences want to see. He plays them as the British aristocrat to a T, the sort of stereotype of what Americans want to see in a British aristocrat. And I think he delivers. Is it the most accurate Cornwallis? No.
I can't help but think about how Wilkinson as Cornwallis fits into the pantheon of portrayals of generals in movies that are fighting against the Americans, right? So I'm thinking about Martin Sheen and Robert Duvall as Robert E. Lee in two separate films about the Civil War, or the German generals in Patton, right? That we have this this way where we try to portray the enemy either as these cartoonish villains or with Lee. And again, this is a whole separate track with Wallace Cross Theology, thinking about Lee in the film Gettysburg and how he's portrayed there, right? And so there's this, I think, again, this thing about how The Patriot is an over-the-top action film with, if you look at the cast as a whole, it has a great cast.
Yeah.
But Wilkinson, in every scene he's in as Cornwallis, when he's complaining about his horse blanket or the like, he always steals the show.
He's phenomenal.
And they allude to, the thing is, they allude to Cornwallis in the film, so Gibson, when they steal his personal correspondence and he reads his diary and he goes, "I've been inside the mind of a genius. Cornwallis knows more about war than we hope to learn in 100 lifetimes." So they give him this, but I think what they're really building on is sort of the perceived arrogance. He's a British aristocrat. He's used to giving orders. He's not used to discussions. But I think they're really playing on the sort of the later depiction of Cornwallis as, why does Cornwallis put himself on Yorktown Peninsula? Clearly arrogance. Whereas there's a bit more nuance there about him ordering to, form a naval port for winter. His belief the British Navy will be able to rescue him. Why? Because the British Navy has been able to basically dominate the seas for the entire war. So I think some of that gets built into the character.
I want to go actually to a couple different spots here and kind of keying off of Rob. Rob, first of all, I've got a hot take on Gettysburg I've got to address now before I forget, which is that Martin Sheen is awful. Awful in Gettysburg. He is a terrible Robert E. Lee. One of my great peeves as a guy from the Upper South is when other people try to do a Southern accent and it just comes off as cartoonish. And I thought that... As much as I love Martin Sheen, and I was just talking yesterday about like my favorite people ask me who my favorite president is. So it's Jed Bartlett. That's my favorite president. I love Martin Sheen, but he is so god awful in Gettysburg, which again is a super complicated film that at some point in time I'm sure we'll cover on this because it does a lot of neat stuff. But that movie, I mean, I just want to say
it's also 3 weeks long.
It's 3 weeks long, but it does give us one of the great gifts of all time, the bayonets.
Yeah. You can just watch that and call it a day.
Jeff Daniels, I mean, is Jeff Daniels low-key one of the great actors of our lives? I mean,
he played George Washington. I mean, not many people have done that.
Well, he played George Washington, right? He plays Chambers in Gettysburg. Then he's also in Dumb and Dumber, or Chamberlain in Gettysburg. I'm sorry. His range is ridiculous. Another film I was thinking about actually about the way that like opposing generals are presented was actually in We Were Soldiers, which is another, of course, Mel Gibson film. And forgive me because I cannot remember the North Vietnamese commander's name or the actor at the top of my, because I wasn't planning on going there today. But he's actually presented in that film in a very sympathetic light, as far as like this guy's portrayed as a very intelligent man. And I think a lot of ways by showing guys like this as hyper intelligent and very skilled, it helps to show the eventual upset of the forces, at the very end of the film, like we have in The Patriot, right? Because you have Cornwallis is this great guy, defeating him is the hard thing to do. The other thing, though, Craig, I want to talk about is like your idea about like Yorktown. Are either of you familiar with J.R. McNeil's Mosquito Empires?
No, I'm not.
So McNeil is he's an environmental historian, and one of the arguments he makes is that Cornwallis wasn't chased out of South Carolina by Nathaniel Greene. He was chased out of South Carolina by mosquitoes, and one of the reasons why they're trapped at Yorktown is the entirety of the British force in Yorktown is sick with malaria. They couldn't put a garrison up front to defend that post once they get over there. And I think it's one of the fascinating things is like, and obviously some other films have been done about disease and warfare. Disease, obviously a huge part of warfare and so forth. But for me, it's a portion of that book, Mosquito Empires, which is just enlightening to me. Was thinking about, wait a second, these soldiers who are fighting are not just fighting and they're shooting at the other guys, but they're also having to overcome the conditions, being on top of being on the run from South Carolina all the way back up to Virginia, so forth.
I think that's a great point about how disease plays a role in war. I would also add to that, though, I think it is a bit weird that in terms of thinking about American films about American wars, it is rather interesting that we don't, say, have a great film about Saratoga. At least I can't think of one. And, even Yorktown, as important a battle as it is, it's just kind of portrayed at the very end of the movie. And it's like, well, of course they lost at Yorktown. That's the end of the movie. That's how the story is supposed to end.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the cases of malaria in the British Army. Again, I'm not discounting it, but they were able to build defensive works both around Yorktown and then outside the actual town itself. And they even at one point are even attempting to mount an escape by crossing the York River. So I'm not sure the categorization that they're not able to mount any defense is accurate, because they're the siege is going on for weeks. But I'm absolutely going to look into that now, because I'm legitimately interested.
I have a colleague of mine who was a colleague of mine at the University of South Carolina, our PhD program, named Gary Selleck, who has done a lot of work on the role of sleep deprivation in the Revolutionary War, in particular, how soldiers are trying to fight both each other and also their lack of sleep. And how, again, I think this shows how military history in recent years has tried to take different approaches to thinking about warfare and combat in ways that we haven't done before.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the Patriot does show some of the hardships of soldiering. Mm-hmm. Staying out in a swamp, having to steal provisions. But it's not as gritty as far as, or you're not seeing the disease, the trauma in the same way that you would in some other, let's say Vietnam era depictions of soldiering. And which is interesting, because Gibson's going to, right after this, he's going to make a Vietnam movie.
Or even thinking with the Revolutionary era, I mean, even John Adams gets into this a bit with the episode where they show the inoculation against smallpox and the like. But I think, again, this is all leading back to our broader point, which is thinking about the Patriot more as a revenge action movie and less as a comprehensive account of the Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War.
But the thing is, if we're evaluating it as a revenge movie, let's forget the history. It's a revenge movie. It's a pretty good revenge movie.
Oh, without question.
It hits all the beats you want it to hit. It's got a compelling hero. It's got a really good villain. It's got some interesting side characters. It's got a legitimate motivation. It's not, his son is killed, his other son is taken and then killed. I mean, so it's like Liam Neeson would go on a rampage through like Paris and Berlin over something like this. And it hits everything you need to do. Gibson does revenge films well, regardless of what you want to say about him. I mean, because you could say Braveheart's essentially a revenge film. There's a wider message of Scottish independence there, but it's basically a revenge film over the death of his wife. And, he's done plenty of movies like that, whether it's, Payback. He's compelling in those. And at the time these movies come out, he's a top level star. He hasn't had his fall from grace yet. That's probably 4 years out at the earliest, 4 to 6 years out before he just,
And I think it's interesting if we think about Patriot in terms of how Mel Gibson handles history. I think there's an interesting point to be made, because he's made the Patriot, he does Braveheart. He's about to make We Were Soldiers. And then after that, he does Passion of the Christ. And then he does
Apocalypto right after that.
Right, exactly.
So he's pretty all over the place and pretty wide ranging in his topics.
Right. I mean, I think he's one of the few actors I can think of who is in a bunch of different historically based films that cover different time periods. It's actually, you could do a whole episode of this just about Gibson movies and how those films deal with history.
You absolutely could. The other person who I would say, if you're saying who is, the historical film actor, I would go Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston was in everything. If you needed a leading man and involved in period clothing, you pulled out old Chuck Heston.
Oh, definitely.
So I mean, here's the thing, and I know we have to talk about it, and I know Jason would probably ask us about it. Mel Gibson, right? You can't talk about this movie without talking about Mel Gibson. Does how we remember this movie change if it's not Gibson, if he doesn't have all of his issues, starting in the mid-2000s? I mean, the one line, I love this line because I think it, in hindsight, people sometimes forget how big Gibson was. And like we talked about, this is like Pete Gibson. He's just made and I think is it the same year he made What Women Want, which was like the huge rom-com of like its day. It was right around this time.
Yeah, it's the same time.
In 1999, Gibson does a guest appearance on The Simpsons. And the premise is that he's doing a remake of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and everyone loves it except Homer. But he takes Homer's advice because he thinks Homer's the only one that can be honest with him. He talks about how the IRS pays his taxes for him. And the line he says is, "The problem I have is people love me so much they never criticize me. It's hell being Mel." And that was, I think, a pretty good assessment of how Gibson was viewed in, circa 99 when this movie's being made.
Well, I think that really shows how The Patriot as a film is even symbolic of a different age in the history of Hollywood. That someone like Gibson, I think a lot of younger film fans now don't realize how big of a deal Mel Gibson was. If Mel Gibson was in a movie, folks were going to go out to see it just because he was in it.
He did Hamlet speaking in iambic pentameter, and it was like, we must see it.
Right, yeah.
And it even gets mentioned in Clueless.
I mean, Gibson had I really think like a calamitous fall from grace in the early mid 2000s. It's difficult to really make any comparisons, but it's if you were to tell a film fan circa 2000 after The Patriot comes out that tell them the trajectory of Gibson's career after that, they'd be, I think, very surprised.
Oh yeah, I mean, and if you could say like The Passion was probably that he got flack for The Passion for a number of reasons, but that movie printed money, and I mean, he reached I don't know how many people saw that, but that was like huge. And though he was criticized, he was still there. But it was, you were starting to see the little, the little, they were starting to poke some holes in him and, or reveal parts of him. I mean, whichever way you want to look at it, but it was catastrophic. But the thing is, Gibson was just nominated for an Oscar not that long ago for Hacksaw Ridge. So there's another history movie. He's got World War II. Can't do history without World War II. So is Gibson being rehabilitated?
That's a good question. I think at the very least, there's a certain point at which I think folks say, well, maybe it's time for us to move on, maybe give him another chance, or at least we know what he said, we know what he did, but maybe it's time for us to just let him back in the club, so to speak.
I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I mean, to fall as hard as he did and then get an Oscar nomination, after that, and now he's doing like family friendly movies, like what was it, Daddy's Home?
Oh, that's
the
right,
sequel.
Yeah,
I don't think Mel Gibson will ever be what he was, and that's up to viewers if they want to pay to see him.
Although I do think Gibson also, just thinking about Gibson as an actor, just separate from The Patriot for just a brief second, Gibson also represents, I think, a Hollywood's past in the sense that he was a leading man for so long in a variety of different movies and genres. Whereas I think now the assumption is if you're a major actor in Hollywood, you're either involved in, say, some sort of franchise, or you're just someone who's seen in a bunch of films. But you look at Gibson's corpus of work, and you mentioned his work in films on history. We can't forget Gallipoli.
Oh, yeah.
Either.
That's fantastic.
A great film. And even the films that he's in, right? Gallipoli is a very gritty, nuanced take on the First World War. It's an Australian film. It's looking at that conflict from that point of view. I think, again, there's Gibson's own career offers different examples of how Hollywood and other cinematic places, how they handle history. They did do it in very different ways.
Rightly or wrongly, I think Gibson will forever be linked with The Patriot, and his personal actions will forever also be linked with The Patriot. And I think it will be difficult for viewers, at least in the very near future, or maybe even not maybe the more distant future, to separate the two. And I think it's always going to cloud it in a way that, other controversial actors or controversial directors their reputations or their actions or their words have attached themselves to their work, to their art. And the question is always, can you separate the art from the artist? And I think that's one of these cases here where it's some people will be able to say, hey, this is a good movie. Other people will say, you know what, I can't support Mel Gibson because of any variety of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we even see this with perhaps his best known films, the Mad Max franchise, where I think folks, even if they look fondly on those movies, they're still thinking in terms of, well, how much can we really enjoy these films if Gibson's in it? How does this affect?
That's why you got to put Tom Hardy in it.
Well, exactly. That's what's happened is that people kind of think of Mad Max and I think of the most recent Mad Max Fury Road. But I think going back to the start of our conversation, again, there's this idea of Revolutionary War films. And since The Patriot, we have seen the John Adams miniseries, the television series Turn. We've seen various attempts to really portray this era on the big screen and the small screen. But The Patriot still has such a heavy, still really pushes a heavy shadow over everything else about the Revolutionary era.
I just got a message from Jason that he said the hurricane, and now he just texted me, wait, it's back up. So waiting. Yeah, you know what? We don't even need him. We can just do the show ourselves.
I'm back, baby.
Yeah, we were just saying we don't need you. We've just been doing the show ourselves.
Right? Okay. So I don't even know how much.
I have no idea. We talked about Mel Gibson.
I'm so sorry, guys, about this stupid hurricane.
That's the hurricane. So. We talked about Mel Gibson for 20 minutes, what we thought, how he fits with the movie. Can we think about this movie without Mel Gibson? How big?
Yeah, is the movie? Does Mel Gibson make this movie unwatchable?
For some people, I think it does. And this is the inherent art versus the artist. For some people, they could view it as a movie that Gibson in 2000 was. I'm not doing a rank off the top of my head, but top 5.
Easily top 5
stars. I mean, easily top 5.
Absolutely, easily throughout say the late '80s, really starting with Lethal Weapon. I mean, obviously, you think about him as Mad Max and Road Warrior and all that kind of stuff, but that was kind of below that. It was kind of the simmer to the boil. In that
late '90s, I mean, I could go as he's maybe even 1 or 2. The only person I could think of, maybe it's like him and Tom Hanks are up for these type of roles. Obviously, like someone like Arnold or
Can you imagine Tom Hanks as Benjamin Martin? Okay, so can we talk about worst possible casting?
Yeah, he would be. I mean, I don't know. He'd be politely asking, "Could I shoot you, Tavington?" Or I don't know what that would look like.
Well, here's a question: say in 2000, who else could you have in this role as in Gibson's role as Benjamin Martin?
All right, so that's actually a really good question. Who could you have gotten? You could have gotten. There are very few people you could have gotten. No one plays unhinged like Gibson. There are
and it turns out there's a very real reason for that.
Well, but he does it very well. Like, who plays emotionally, physically tortured, haunted by this past, must seek revenge by brutally chopping people up and get blood splattered on his face, and then look skyward to heaven, asking for God's forgiveness all in one shot? Who does that?
Okay, well, you're talking about that. I want to ask you guys about your favorite scenes in the film, because it's that scene where after his son's murdered and he goes and grabs his pistols and obviously the tomahawk, and that is clearly my favorite scene in the film, just because, I don't know, just as an action guy, it's so well shot.
Yeah.
It's very well done. The final thing where he throws the tomahawk at the guy to save Heath Ledger, and just the scene there where he chases down the guy and just hatchets him until, it's brutal. Like, I just don't know who else you got in 2000.
In my opinion, that scene alone is why you get Mel Gibson. I don't know who else could have done that scene that way.
How old is Gibson now? 60-ish? 65?
He is 66 right now. Yeah.
Okay, so guys his age.
I mean, you could have gotten Liam Neeson, who basically Rob Roy was very similar.
Neeson, yeah.
You could have gotten him,
do that.
But he wasn't at the same level as Gibson.
Neeson doesn't sell a movie in 2000. He doesn't sell a movie really until Taken.
Yeah.
And then Taken itself, when it comes out, wasn't supposed to be the hit that it was. In fact, Neeson, we talked about this during when we did the Predator podcast about the evolution of the action star right now. And right now we're in this new post-Bourne action star where you've got Jason Bourne, you've got Brian, was it Mills, I think, in Taken. And, and really with Neeson, he's an older action star. It's really a different ancillary. He's well in his 60s.
This is the end of the twilight of the action gods, where Arnold, Arnold still can open a movie, but he's not what he was.
He's not an action star anymore. He's the memory of an action star.
He's going to have T3 in a few years, but he's not what he was. Stallone isn't what he was. Van Damme is certainly not what he was.
Van Damme was flash in the pan.
Dolph Lundgren straight to TV, DVD.
Did you ever see the movie where Lundgren was fighting against the space alien? I Come in Peace.
Oh yeah,
Jay Billis.
And you go.
Love the movie.
Oh yeah.
Right? He's killing people with CDs because it's 1990 and we don't know what a CD is.
Alien technology. But I think there are very few people. I mean, I think Russell Crowe could have done it, but he wasn't a household name yet.
The only person I could think may have had a chance, and even he, I think I'm very skeptical on. This is also late in terms of action movies and action stars. This is still the tail end of Bruce Willis's, I think, relevance.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Bruce Willis would have made a very different movie than what we got with Mel Gibson.
It would have been.
Even he couldn't.
It would have been.
Mel Gibson's a much better actor than Bruce Willis. Right. I think one of the ththings is again, Mel Gibson's obviously an incredibly flawed human being with a lot of stuff. But if it's possible, just talk about him as the artist. He's actually a very talented guy, and he does that on his. There's another guy here that I'm thinking about actually that has that ability that you couldn't cast for some pretty obvious reasons here. It's actually Denzel. See, I think Denzel actually has that.
All right,
that
Man on Fire is one of the all-time great revenge movies.
I watched it the other day. Rewatched it the other day.
It's phenomenal. Yes, I absolutely think Denzel could have done it, but
he's not explosive like Gibson.
Well,
he's got this simmering, but the angry, like you see him in his own version of the Brian Mills.
The Equalizer.
Film. The Equalizer, right? Yeah, he's cooler. He's cool.
Gibson gets the tortured angle though. That there are very few people can do that. Mm-hmm. Or at least in the way he does it.
I think Russell Crowe's probably the best. Russell Crowe's younger than Gibson, although Russell Crowe probably old enough to pull it off. Also Australia, I think Crowe's actually from New Zealand.
Born in New Zealand, raised in Australia.
Right. But when you think about people of that age, who else are you going to go? Malkovich, So I just think in this case, Gibson was kind of the perfect cast for this. I think it's what makes the film really rewatchable is that the film is actually very well cast. Jason Isaacs is a tremendous villain. He's got that down pat. You've got a rising Heath Ledger who is emerging onto the screen and has like one of the very first 5-6 film debuts in film history, just blowing up the screen. And this was like he was already on the star-making vehicle, but this was like the perfect film for him.
Young Aussie with established Aussie.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the thing. I mean, I think you're right. What makes this film for 2000 in many ways makes it so problematic for 2022.
All right, well, fine. Let's make it. Let's unproblematize it, or double problematize it. You're making this film in 2022.
Yeah.
Who is Benjamin Martin? Who do you have? A roughly 50-year-old guy?
At this point, I would probably go Crowe.
I think Crowe's too old and he's too fat. Also, 50 is not that old now. I'm 45, and I'm like, these guys are not that much older than me.
I would say, I think, though, if we're asking the question of what this film looks like in 2022, then you'd have to also, even if you're making a revenge action film set in the Revolutionary War, I think there would be a bit more sensitivity to some of the things we've mentioned this evening. Yeah. And so I think Craig's point about Denzel, I'm thinking, what would a Denzel Washington-led Revolutionary War film look like? What would it be about? That would be actually really interesting.
I would love to. Give me Denzel Washington in anything, right?
There's one famous Black Revolutionary War soldier, Prince Hall. I think that would be a fantastic story to tell with just tell it at all. But Denzel is that would be phenomenal. But I mean, like maybe if you're doing if you're doing Patriot today, maybe Hugh Jackman.
Jackman, yeah, Jackman. We've seen he's got the range. He's definitely got the unhingedness when we've seen him as like Wolverine. I wonder about the Marvel world, about whether or not they can ever cast a guy who really encapsulates Wolverine so well. Of course, Jackman famously the second choice.
Yep.
For that particular role.
Technically the third choice.
Who was the
Crow was the first, and he was. I don't think he would I don't even think he would. I'm not reading it. Okay. And then they went to, was it Dougray Scott?
Dougray Scott.
Dougray Scott. Okay.
Yeah. Dougray Scott was the guy I was heard, and who got held back because he was filming a Mission Impossible 2, which is easily the most forgettable of that series. And I don't think it's because of Dougray Scott. I think it's John Woo is a horribly overrated director.
But it's also, come on, you're not. Tom Cruise had long, shaggy hair. You cannot compete with Tom.
It was far too. That was a far too stylized film. But that's always my complaint on John Woo stuff. But I have a question for you, actually, flashing back to this MCU. Is George Washington the first American superhero?
Of course. 6'20", made of radiation.
I mean, there can't really be anybody before him now. I think you're in a way. In a way, you're right, I think, actually, because that says a lot about American culture.
I mean, if you think about it, not to make a joke of it, but if you're thinking about, he even gets like these origin stories in like early biographies, born fully clothed, cannot tell a lie. He's given this element. And there's even a famous line by John Adams that actually appears in 1776, the musical. I'm paraphrasing that. Benjamin Franklin electrified the ground and outsprang George Washington. So, this sort of,
that's good.
This element, I think it's absolutely there. He's America's first.
So why don't we have our Washington?
I have no idea.
That's a good question.
I have no idea.
Well, let's do this. Cast George Washington right now. Who do you have as Washington?
Jackman.
You like Jack? Well, Jackman's 6'2".
Really?
All right. Rob, who you like?
See, that's... honestly, I think if you did a George Washington biopic, I think the question becomes, how much of his life would you cover, for one? I think, because, like the Lincoln film, which I love, only covers 1865.
I think that's
a smart move on Lincoln, too.
Yeah, I think it is. So I think with a Washington biopic, would you cover Revolutionary War? Would you cover his presidency? I think that kind of changes who you cast.
I think you have to go Washington's Crossing. I think that's the way to go. That moment. You could literally make it. You could make it a movie about 10 days. You can make a movie about a night, but I think that's the moment I would pick.
So so how old was Washington during the Crossing?
So he's born in 1732. Crossing is in 1776. So he's still, relatively. So was it 40 something? The 40 something then?
Oh my gosh, he's my age. I should be George Washington.
No, you shouldn't.
I should absolutely. I'm 6'2" tall. I too am made out of oak. I feel like this is actually my calling. I'm gonna have to shave my beard. All right, so who do we like? So actually, if that's
just make sure if you play Washington, you cannot skip leg day. Just keep that in mind.
You know what? I'm gonna go. Who is it? Who is it? Just bought the Wrexham team. I'm gonna go with the guy from Canada, Deadpool.
Ryan Reynolds.
Ryan Reynolds
is George Washington. I don't see that.
Ryan Reynolds is George Washington. I don't think he's got the chops to do it, but I love Ryan. Like I love Ryan Reynolds. I think he's great.
Rob, who's your pick?
I mean, I think the Hugh Jackman pick is a good one.
I do too.
Because I really cannot think of anyone else who could pull out the role successfully.
David Morse.
Well, I thought he was fantastic.
God, he was good.
He was great.
And
John Adams.
And the guy who played him in Turn, I'm forgetting his name right now. I'm gonna get myself in trouble. The guy who played him in Turn was fantastic, but the problem is, can David Morse, or I'm looking up who it was, or Ian Khan open a big blockbuster movie? I don't think so.
No, you really have to have somebody. And really, one of the things that the difficulties I think about selling something with Washington is the American imagination of Washington, because of like the fact that of the wigs and the apparel and so forth. We have an idea of Washington as an elder statesman. So the idea of Washington as a 45-year-old guy, a guy my age, a fighting man, is kind of hard for Americans to accept, even though he was well noted for his horsemanship, This guy is a guy who obviously fought in the 7 Years' War. This guy was a soldier.
And he's noted for his imposing physical appearance.
Yes, absolutely.
Strength.
Right. This is going to be, so now I have a choice for Washington, and this is going to be controversial. I think he'd have to wait a few years to actually play him.
I just said Ryan Reynolds.
40s. Well, I was going to say Henry Cavill. Because he has that physical, he could be physically imposing. I think him playing Superman has given him a sense of how to play a larger than life character. But Cavill's been in so many action roles over the years, in so many roles, period. I think if you gave him the right script, I think he can maybe pull it off.
Cavill's phenomenal in Mission Impossible. I think it's his best role. He was really good as a villain. And of course, look, it fits in with you. Cavill's a British guy. And we'll never see him as Bond, so we might as well get him as Washington. I'm down with Cavill. I don't know if I'm ready for people to be swooning over George Washington in the movie theater, but I guess that's entirely possible. I got a question for. Okay, so one of the running threads of tonight has been the fact that we don't have any Revolutionary War films. We got 1776 and we've got Hamilton, but those are both musicals and they're both for the stage. We've all acknowledged John Adams, which we all love, but that's a miniseries on HBO, and that's probably 20 years old at this point in time, is it not? It's a bit older.
2008, maybe?
15 years old.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, that feels right. So it's 15 years old, right? We don't have, aside from this film, I can't think of another Revolutionary War film at all in the last 30 years.
There are others if you go back further.
Okay.
There's even a Hamilton movie from the 30s with George Washington basically wearing makeup, and I think it's even a silent film. So there things exist, but in recent memory, not really.
Okay, well, pitch me a Revolutionary War film, like from your own work or for a story that you guys like, something like that.
All right, so. Again, if I am head of a studio and I have to greenlight a project, it's either I'm doing a Washington movie set around Washington's crossing of Christmas 1776. I'm picking that, or my second pick is to option David Hackett Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride, which has been optioned before, and to do Paul Revere's Midnight.
Absolutely. I love that book.
And do Paul Revere's Midnight Ride the right way. You're going to hit espionage. You're going to hit Lexington and Concord. I think that book is basically a movie in and of itself. And it's been optioned.
That's a hell of a book.
It's been optioned before. It just never gets made. So it was actually optioned by the same people that did The Conspirators about the Lincoln assassination. And it got really close, and it just never happened. So if I'm greenlighting something, I'm picking either Fisher's Washington's Crossing or Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride, and I'm
You ready to hear from my dark horse, Paul Revere?
Who?
Jonah Hill is Paul Revere.
Okay, so if you're going looks, it's Jack Black all the way.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And I think Jack Black's actually got serious acting chops that he just
does have good chops.
He gets overlooked because he's a comedic actor, like all comedic actors. I think comedic actors can play drama, but I don't think dramatic actors can do comedy.
Rob, what's your movie?
I guess coming back to the Southern Theater again, I actually would think a movie, you have to kind of maybe stretch things a little bit with this story, but I think The Siege of Savannah make an interesting film because you have not only the British and the Americans, but you have Haitian troops there too. You could actually really talk about the wider world of the Revolutionary era through that particular moment.
I want some books on the American Revolution that you guys love. Somewhere along the line, someone listening to this podcast will go like, I want to read a book on the Revolution. What do you guys got?
So again, I've already name dropped Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride and Washington's Crossing.
Paul Revere's Ride.
Washington's Crossing. I think those are the two of the best. If you want,
those are a little older books, though. Those are what 2000.
Paul Revere's Ride is 95, and Washington's Crossing is 04.
Okay.
If you how would you want recent books?
Whatever comes to mind, because I think actually, so for people listening right now, there's actually this divide in academia about how we teach history, right? And there's the idea that there's one philosophy that seems to be prevalent, which is that you need to always be introducing the latest, newest stuff. I'm actually not a fan of that. I actually think that like you actually go with the hits, with the real stuff. Like I can't ever see not assigning W.E.B. Du Bois. We talk about Reconstruction or something like that. I think you have to, right? Even if it's at the cost of like showing you the latest scholarship. I don't give a shit about that. I want the stuff that matters.
You know you're on the job market, right?
You know, one of the things I had coming up to grad school is that I didn't get to read the hits because I was so busy trying to read the latest stuff.
I will say to your point, one of my books that I want to recommend is Benjamin Quarles' Negro of the American Revolution. That was such an important book for me, reading it just to see how Quarles writes about the Black presence in the Revolution. It's an older work, but it's still really influential. I will just very quickly add two other books. More recent, Liberty is Sweet by Woody Holton. I think Holton's work on revolution is really, really fascinating. I think that's kind of the culmination of his work.
So Rob, don't hate me. I have to do this then. I have to recommend Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution,
which I like. I also like that one too. I look, I took classes under Holton at USC, and I enjoy Gordon Wood's work. In fact, I gave Gordon Wood a ride to the airport, but that's another story for the time.
Have we just entered the Goodwill Hunting portion of the night?
Well, I will say this, though. Going back to books about the revolution, my last recommendation, this is the book, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History by David Armitage.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I love that book because it gets at not only the revolution, but in particular the document, the Declaration of Independence. And it reminds the reader of, even though today we kind of say, well, this document represents Jefferson's hypocrisy, blah, blah, blah. It reminds us that the document still inspires people around the world and has historically for over 200 years. And so I think that book is a really good one if you want to think about not just the revolution, but what is the legacy of the revolution, which is something that we're all grappling with. And of course, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in a few years. So that'll be up.
Can I interject something into my own podcast? Because I got two books myself, which I actually think don't necessarily make for great films, but I think would make for awesome miniseries. One is Kathleen Duvall's Independence Lost. Are either of you familiar with this one?
I mean, you couldn't do that as a movie.
No, that would have to be a series, right?
I don't know how you would do
right. Well, I think, and also a film, I think a book that complements that really well is Maya Jazanov's Liberty's Exiles, right? Where you're
sure.
Where you're talking, both of these books tell these very person-centric stories, right? With a lot of, kind of focusing in on the personal motivations for people to join in, or to join in or completely withhold from this movement. Especially because one of the things for me working as I do in the Native South is the fact that the American Revolution in Indian country was a real source of crisis. For Native peoples that had allies or relationships with these colonies or this burgeoning republic. What do you do about this fight over here? Do you set it out? And because look, 7 Years' War was just a few years ago, and that was hell for a lot of indigenous communities in North America. And then you've got this war, this new thing. Geez, these guys are fighting again, So I think Independence Lost is really great. And then, of course, Liberty's Exiles. The idea is like, we get so carried away with the idea of like, okay, the Americans win the rebels win this war, and then we found the United States, and that happens. Well, what happens to the losers? Rob, what happens to the people in the empire after Jedi?
I think that's a great miniseries for Canada, though, Jason.
I think so. I really, man, I'm telling you, I think these are, and they're really fascinating because the loyalists had their own reasons. If the war were, if American independence were so inevitable and it were such a great idea, then why did so many people fight against it? I want to make sure that that argument is there too. My son comes home from school, tells me about the 13 colonies. I'm like, all right, cool. What about the other ones? And he looks at me, he's like, what? Tell me about the other colonies, Jack, who didn't, rebel. Tell me about Canada. Tell me about East and West Florida. Tell me about the Caribbean, colonies. Why didn't, if revolution was such an obvious solution, why wasn't it unanimous?
Because it was a radical idea for the time.
Are you talking about the radicalism of the American Revolution?
I don't know. Make of that what you will.
Did it. You brought it back. You said the name of them. So right. I've kept you guys on here long enough. Let me ask you guys this as we're closing in, and God knows we may have to retape the first hour and a half of this pod thanks to Hurricane.
The nerve
Nicole.
of you getting a hurricane.
I know. It's Hurricane Craig and Hurricane Rob. Is The Patriot a history movie?
Yeah, it's absolutely a history movie. It depicts the feel of an era with some major flaws. But if you're looking at some of the detail, they had the Smithsonian Institute working as fact checkers on this. It's absolutely a history movie. You can get elements of the American Revolution from it. And it's also captures a moment of time and how Americans viewed the American Revolution or how they wanted to view the American Revolution in circa 2000.
Yeah, I think it's as much a history movie as most other history films, again, because you think about cinema and history, it's not so much trying to portray the accuracy of the past so much as Craig mentioned, the feel of the past. And I think The Patriot certainly gets to that in a number of different ways.
Again, my only thoughts on this is that if you're watching this and if you are a teacher or you're signing this in class, my only concern on a film like this is, it's absolutely a history film, right? But it's you got to curate the hell out of this.
But that's why it's a great film for class discussion. You can actually discuss it, and there's different ways to view it. There's different ways to get at it, and it's great for class discussion. I mean, so long as you have someone who is informed moderating it. If students walked away, this is how it happened, that's a problem. The one thing I will say, my final thought on The Patriot, and I'm posing this question to all of you. If, there's a big if Braveheart hadn't come out before and Gladiator hadn't come out, I think, a couple of weeks before, do we remember The Patriot differently? Is it just that it couldn't measure up to those two movies?
That's a really good question. Never thought of it in that way, but I think you're onto something that The Patriot is partially hurt by when it comes out. It's sandwiched between other great historical epics, and I think in many ways acquires reputation for not being as serious a film because it's coming out after Braveheart and right around Gladiator.
Here's my thing, though. I'm going to actually say this is the more rewatchable of the three films. Braveheart and Gladiator are 3+ hours, I believe, each. And the protagonist dies in both films, right? They are big and heavy. And, God bless it. Patriot, I can turn the movie on and my brain off. So it's not the movie that the other two are, right? I mean,
but that's why it was on TBS every Saturday for 20 years.
American audiences are going to respond to the Patriot in ways that don't respond to Braveheart or Gladiator. And Americans do, by and large, love, I think, those other two films. Even as complicated, Braveheart is a whole other ball of wax that I've got to address on this pod. Gladiator, maybe not as much, so I think it's probably of the three films we're talking about, maybe hews more closely to reality than the other two. I said maybe. Look, we said this earlier. Don't ever let facts get in the way of building a good story, right? And that does get down to these ideas of these historical films, right? It's these larger truths you're trying to tell about the human experience. And really that's what they're trying to do is take historical situations to tell personal stories. This Patriot takes the American Revolution to tell a story about betrayal and maybe redemption for Martin, of getting past his horrors that he committed during the French and Indian War and, finding family again after the end of all of that, right? Same with, Gladiator's a very personal journey. And then Braveheart has horses. So those are my thoughts on, I can't get past the horses with the pikes. It's just too much for me. Anyway, guys, where can we find you guys online? Where can we find you on Twitter or Mastodon or God knows what social media sites will be available wherever?
I'm still on Twitter so long as it remains at Craig Bruce Smith. And you can also visit my website, which is craigbrucesmith.com.
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter as well. I'm under the handle Rob Greene II, Rob Greene II. Very easy to find on Twitter. I'm not yet leaving the site. I'm also, of course, one of the editors for Black Perspectives and pub chair for Society of Years Intellectual Historian. So I'm pretty easy to find online for better or for worse.
Craig, Rob, thank you guys both so much for being here tonight during Hurricane Nicole. here in South Florida, which is raving over my house right now.
No, this is good. It's fun.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you again to everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you especially to our guests, my two great friends, Craig Smith and Robert Greene II. Thanks, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell. And thanks to me, of course, for being the brains, the driving force, everything behind this, really the light in your day, Jason Herbert. And if you want to find out more about Historians of the Movies, you can look for us on Twitter at #HATM or follow me at Herbert History. This week, we're doing a really cool movie, Sunday night on Netflix, 8 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be doing this new film with Viola Davis called Woman King. And you can keep following us wherever you follow your podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. Please do share this community that we're trying to grow. And thanks for being part of it. See you next time.